Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure. Very exciting to be here with you tonight. Thank you for all the kind words, Clint and Ardis as well. Thank you for organizing everything. What we're going to do is we're going to think about what are some of the most essential notions, ideas that Lacan puts forward in his first seminar. So I'll start with a few introductory words just about that seminar. And then I'm going to try and do something that Clint alluded to very nicely and generously in his comments, and that's to try and extract some practical ideas. One of the challenges with Lacanian theory and Lacanian texts is typically that they're almost impossible. But the tension there and the paradox is they may seem to be impossible, but underlying the whole Lacanian agenda, presumably, is a series of guidelines and ideas about how to maintain and manage and effectively work clinically. So it seems to me, if we just keep that in mind, that there is some practical utility to these texts that can be very helpful. Okay, so let us begin. I'm going to try to pull out a few standout quotes from the first section of Seminar 1. That's the first 5 lessons. And I will offer some comments on those, and then I will offer 2 clinical anecdotes. And then hopefully after that, we can break for some questions and input. So 2 points of contextualization. The material that we're looking at comes from 1954, January and February 1954. Just a few months before that, Lacan had delivered his statement of intent, you could put it that way, in Rome. This is the well-known Rome Discourse, which is subsequently written up and published as Function and Field of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis. That's a lengthy text. It's a somewhat intimidating text, but it's the text where Lacan says, this is where we're going. This is my manifesto in many ways. And my manifesto is going to be about a return to Freud, a return to a careful, although critical, nuanced reading of Freud, which he suggests will work against ego psychology domestications of the Freudian radicality. So it's kind of impressive to me that that's talk in which Lacan also kind of consigns his previous work to the status of his antecedents, that this talk is merely months before Seminar 1 begins. So this is Lacan beginning properly. He's 52 years old, he's got a lot of critiques to make, and you can start to see, particularly if you read Function and Field prior to Seminars 1, 2, and 3, that he already has a pretty well-developed roadmap of all the key themes that he wants to address in the following 3 seminars. What's also worth noting is that Seminar 1 and Seminar 2, Seminar 1 is Freud's papers on technique, and Seminar 2 is about Freud's theory of the ego. They are very much intertwined. And it makes sense then, when we look to some of the, one of the most important helpful commentary texts, reading Lacan Seminar 1 and 2, that in a way you could think Seminar 1 and 2 as together. The themes are very much interwoven. Okay, I'll say one other thing. Different institutes where Lacan's work is taught to the ends of clinical training have, typically gravitate towards different periods of Lacan's teaching. The place where I did a lot of my training in London was very much focused on the first 10 years of Lacan's, well, I suppose you could say first decade, first maybe 11 years. And the reason I mention that is that I think an argument can be made that seminars 1, 2, 3, 4, these in some ways are, I don't know if we could say that they're the most important of Lacan's work, but in terms of trying to glean crucial clinical strategies, to refine Freudian concepts, to think about an ethics of practice in a properly Freudian way, you could say that these are the seminars are the best place to start. One last point before we begin. Let's think about Lacan, not so much as this Parisian enfant terrible, this provocative, problematic guy, which in some respects we could. Let's think about him tonight as someone who is prompting us to try and innovate and think differently about our technique, about how we situate ourselves in a clinical encounter, how we try to facilitate that. In a way, we could even say that the subtitle of this approach tonight is thinking about Lacan as technical innovator. Anyways, with that in mind, let us begin. You could say that in the first couple of sessions in Seminar 1, Lacan is, I suppose, obviously very concerned with not just why technique is so crucial to psychoanalytic practice, but also with a very robust and developed critique of existing techniques of psychoanalytic practice. So here's my first quote from Lacan. He says, this is around page 10, it is always in relation to the question, what do we do when we do analysis, that I have up until now offered this commentary of Freud. My starting point is the current state of technique. So I think we may sometimes neglect that. You know, there's a sense that Lacan is this flamboyant author, writer, so on and so forth. There's tons of books, tons of seminars. But you could say that maybe his most essential early contribution to psychoanalysis comes in terms of the interrogation of tired psychoanalytic modes of treatment, of technique, and how he wants to revitalize that. Back to that quote, he wants to prioritize the question of technique, and then he goes on to say, it would not be an exaggeration to call the state of technique today in psychoanalysis a state of radical confusion. He then really pretty quickly moves on to a notion of the two-body psychology, or a kind of two-person psychology. He name-checks Ballant. He says Ballant's notion of a two-body psychology is now omnipresent in the psychoanalytic field. And he goes on to make this comment, and this will give us our first theme of the evening. You are obviously aware that there is no two-body psychology without the intervention of a third element. If we take speech as the central feature of our perspective, then it is within a three rather than a two-term relationship that we have to formulate the analytic experience in its totality. He goes on, he says the foundation of the inter-analytic relation is something that we are obliged to represent as being triadic. So here's our first theme. We know that he's emphasizing questions of technique, and he thinks that this is maybe the first step one needs to take in a radical rethinking of where psychoanalysis is and the role of Freud. And now we get this paradox of how to think a dyad, which is simultaneously a triad. How do we understand what he means by this triadic structure of the psychoanalytic encounter? He thinks this is of irreducible importance to how we go on and think about psychoanalysis. 2 or 3 pages later, he says, the practice that Freud initiated has become transformed into a manipulation of the analyst-analysand relationship. End quote. That's a major problem. And so one of the things I think where we'll start to feel some tension, hopefully we'll have time for questions about this, is that in Lacan's conceptualization, which he claims is also Freud's, it is not simply an analyst-analysand relationship. It's not a two-body psychology or a two-person psychology that is the most crucial vehicle of the treatment. And I like how counterintuitive that sounds, because presumably that's what we think about. I think we think there's me and someone else in the room, we do work. Lacan is kind of disputing that right off the bat. Moving on. In that same section of the first session of Seminar 1, he says, Freud prioritizes the singularity of each case. And here's the direct quote. Freud here's the direct quote, the reconstitution of the subject's history. This is the element that is essential and constitutive for analytic progress. This point he reiterates a few pages further down, the reintegration by the subject of his or her history up to the furthermost perceptible limits. So let's just pull out a couple of additional themes. Number one, we've already seen this triadic structure. Number two is he prioritizes time and time again speech itself. Now, if you know anything about Lacan, you know language is important, but what we're getting here is a pronounced emphasis on the performative and curative, you could say the ethical dimension of speech. Lacan wants to constantly encourage speechify. You could put it in these terms. So speech, so we need to see what is efficacious, what is most important about the spoken dimension. But that's clearly something. So that we could say is our second theme. How does he think speech and the utility of speech? But we've also now got this idea of the singularity of each case. And we could just do a little footnote here and say there's another nice tension in Lacanian theory. In Lacanian clinical theory, we're always talking about structure. You know, is this person situated in the structure of neurosis? Is this structurally a case of psychosis? So you hear about structure, this diagnostic language, a lot, and it helps to be able to think clinically in terms of that diagnostic language. But at the same time, Lacan, following Freud, wants to always emphasize the singularity of a case, how any given case is not reducible to a series of objectifications, to a series of given understandings and pieces of knowledge that the clinician might have. So just to emphasize that. But I think our third theme here, the reconstitution of the subject's history, what is through speech, which kind of develops the speech theme. What does he mean by this? He goes on to make some qualifying comments about what he means by history. And he keeps on emphasizing this idea that there must be a reconstitution of the subject's history through their speech. He emphasizes, history, he says, another direct quote, is not the past, but is instead the past as it is historicized in the presence of the other. In other words, it's not simply what the subject comes to remember. That's not so important. What matters is what he or she reconstructs of it. Okay, so it's not simply a remembering process. I mean, you know, presumably that happens. But what is crucial is that that remembering process needs to happen through the medium of speech. It has to be spoken. And in the action, the performative utterance of speech, the enunciative dimension of taking on a relationship to one's history, something new can be produced. So there's an idea of a reconstitution, not simply a remembering. What matters, he says, is what the subject reconstructs. Here's another quote, and this emphasizes that this reconstitution, this reconstruction always needs to occur through the register of speech. It's less a matter of remembering than of rewriting history, he says. We could say, furthermore, that this is not simply about a more accurate or normal relationship to reality. Okay, let me then add another theme. Towards the end of the first session in Seminar 1, Lacan starts to introduce one of his most rigorous critiques. And one of those critiques, which will continue apace all the way through Seminar 2, is a critique of how the notion of the ego has been understood, and a critique of how the ego has been centralized as the central concept. And, you know, we don't have to think very hard about that to hear notions of ego strength, so on and so forth. I'll say more about that, but he's very much opposed to that prioritization, that conceptual and clinical centralization of the ego. But he is also highly, and this is part and parcel of that critique actually, he's highly critical of the idea that one should at some level aim to adjust or facilitate the subject's harmonization or homeostasis or adaptation to something called reality. And again, that sounds pretty counterintuitive, because you could say, well, I mean, surely that sounds like a viable objective, but he is always going to be opposed to a kind of normalization process. He's always going to use that kind of language of opposing engineering, human engineering, of a kind of adaptation to what one would take to be reality. And one of the reasons he's opposed to that, not simply because of the more Foucauldian dimension of normalization as a political process, but because in that move, one often finds that the implicit yardstick would be supplied by the clinician's ego and the clinician's sense of what's reality or what would be good for the person. So he's kind of completely opposed to that on an ethical basis.